Good evening, everybody. I'm speaking to you from Australia at the moment. I haven't managed to get back to the UK yet. I can't pretend that I'm rushing back as fast as I can, given the interminable lockdown. But nevertheless, it's 5 o'clock in the morning here in South Australia. So if you can't really follow what I'm saying, that's the explanation for it. This evening we have with us one of the UK's most prominent journalists, Camilla Tominey, who, amongst other things, is the associate editor of the Daily Telegraph. And Camilla has made her name over quite a few years now, particularly as a royal reporter. And I think she knows more about what goes on in the royal family and Buckingham Palace and the royal household than almost anybody else in the country. But she's also a very important political reporter and columnist and commentator. And her views on British politics I've always found extremely interesting. During my time as the Australian High Commissioner, I used to catch up with her from time to time in order just to not only enjoy her company, of course, but to get a really wise perspective on what is happening in British politics and where British politics was going. So, Camilla, welcome. And we really appreciate you coming on and talking to the Royal Overseas League. It's really much appreciated. I'm sorry we can't do it in person and give you a drink after you've done. Oh, no, you don't drink. You're a teetotaler, I think.
I am too. But you could have given me a cup of tea. That will be gratefully accepted come summer.
It must be particularly at the lockdown, a particularly tough time for a teetotaler.
Well, to be fair, that's not what's tough about the lockdown. What's tough about the lockdown is educating 3 children under 12 at home. So whereas others are waiting for the pubs to open, I'm just hanging on to March the 8th for dear life. And I am literally counting down the days. So now Wednesday's over, we've got Thursday, Friday, and next week, 7 days of homeschooling left, and we'll be free. And it very conveniently, that March the 8th date coincides with when we will get the Harry and Meghan Oprah interview clips, which means that I'll be able to comment on this online without my children using up all of my bandwidth.
And of course, the 8th of March is also Commonwealth Day, I think. So the Queen is going to appear publicly as well. She's going to give a talk, make a speech, whatever she's going to do. She's going to do something publicly on the same day.
Yes, with the Duchess of Cambridge.
That's good, yes. Well, look, we'll come back to the royal family. I thought what we might do to start with is over to you, but if you would say a little bit about, well, whatever you want to say, and then I'll come back and do some Q&A. And then for all of you who are on this call, there is a way that you can put in your questions, and then I'll call on you to ask your question orally. We won't just do it through written questions unless you specifically write a question and ask if I could just read it out. I can do that, of course. So Camilla, over to you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. And thank you for having me. And I'm sorry I can't be there in person. Funnily enough, the ROSL has got a dear place in my heart because I actually went viral on Twitter because of the building in London. I had gone there during lockdown to film something, I think for ZDF, the German network. And I then stayed on to film Politics Live. And so I sat in that main sitting room upstairs, and I was happily just about to go on air, and a cleaner from the ROSL just came into view. So you can see me turning around and grimacing, trying to say, don't get in the shot, not least because she was covered head to toe in PPE. And it looked like I was admonishing this poor lady, which she will vouch I wasn't. I was just saying, you're about to go live on the BBC. Anyway, somebody clipped it and suggested it was funny, and I think it made it onto the Guido Fawkes website. So I'd quite like to come back in the summer and actually have a nice cuppa with you all and enjoy it more than I have done in the past. But I suppose I don't want to talk for long because I think it's much more interesting probably for Alexander, who I'm glad to see has not been banned by Facebook and is here with us all tonight. But I think it's probably more easy for him to do a Q&A, and then for you guys to ask me anything you'd like to ask me about either of my two beats, which are royals and politics. Just a little potted history of me, if it's interesting. I was brought up in Hertfordshire. I studied at Leeds University, where I did a law degree. And it was while I was doing that degree, I became endlessly fascinated with all of the criminal cases we were having to study. And what interested me the most was how they were reported at the time. And I remember, and if anyone's as old as I am, they'll remember microfiche at the local library, revealing all wonder of things when it comes to examining newspapers and magazines. And I felt while I was doing my degree that actually, rather than analysing the sort of previous case law and making the case for defendants or others, I would be much rather at the back of the court taking notes and writing it up for a newspaper. So I initially ended up working at my local paper, the Hemel Hempstead Gazette, God love it, which used to be a paid for broadsheet. But now, because of the very sad dissemination of funding for local newspapers and indeed the internet having taken over, it isn't quite what it once was. But it trained me up well, and I went from there to start doing shifts on the national papers to earn extra money. I ended up at the Sunday Express, where I started out as a general news reporter, did a bit of features, and then something very funny happened in 2005 when Charles and Camilla got married. The royal editor at the time decided that was a good idea for him to take a holiday to New Zealand, of all places. And to cut a long story short, the editor didn't look very fondly on that decision, and he decided he would be in need of a new royal editor. So he called me into his office and he said, "Camilla, you dress very nicely and you're called Camilla, so I think you should cover the royal." To which I then replied, "Fine, okay. I've never really thought that much about the royal family. I had very fond memories of Princess Diana, who was very much considered an icon to both my father and my mother. And I vividly remembered, you know, the day like you do, or an older generation does, of Elvis or Kennedy dying. I remembered the day she died, and I remember being glued to the television watching that. So I had an appreciation for the royal family, but no knowledge really of them whatsoever. And I quickly concluded it would be a good beat for a woman to do, because it struck me that there were older women doing it, like Penny Junor or Ingrid Seward or others. So I thought it would be a beat with longevity. And I also thought, frankly, it would be an opportunity to go to some nice places and not have to slum it too much. Having said that, of course, when you do go on royal overseas tours, it's all right for the royals who get chauffeur driven from destination A to destination B, while the press are packed onto coaches and told to get there 8 hours early and to stand behind a rope with a notebook, and then only catch a glimpse of the royals, who most of the time pretend that we're not even there, occasionally hurl the odd amount of insults in our general direction, and generally wish we weren't following them around in this voyeuristic way. So now it's been, what, 15 years of covering the royal family. It was quite boring in the Charles and Camilla era, until, of course, Kate Middleton came on the royal scene. And I would say that it all really took off in 2010, 2011, when William and Kate got engaged. There was then the big royal wedding in 2011, which I covered for the American network NBC. And the rest really is history, because I think that marriage helped to revitalize the royal family, introduce it to a new audience, and created a kind of new Diana era of reportage with a lot of stories going in the papers. And all of you watching this will know how much coverage there has been about Megxit, which we'll get onto shortly, to know that obviously the royals do keep royal correspondents busy. And while I was covering the royals, I also segued into writing a column for the Sunday Express, which was good fun. And then when Brexit happened, it was decided that I should also be repurposed into politics, because Brexit created a second narrative for political coverage, not just covering the day-to-day domestic stuff, but this huge issue of our future relationship with the EU. So I then moved over to Westminster and started digging around there with a notebook, poking around, hanging around Westminster bars. I suppose I went from Green Park to Westminster and back many times, trying to basically get the information we needed to get the inside scoop on what was going on. And I ended up at one time at the Sunday Express being both royal editor, a columnist, and deputy political editor, and then political editor, which was far too much really to handle, and goodness knows why on earth I agreed to do it. And then in September 2018, Rob Winnett, who's the deputy editor of the Telegraph, suggested that it might be a better idea for me to just have one role covering those beats for the Telegraph. And that's how I became associate editor. And I suppose what I've learned in the course of my journalistic career is many different lessons that have largely been taught to me by elders in the profession. Good piece of advice from my editor Martin Townsend at the Sunday Express, which I thought was good. Two good pieces of advice. The first piece of advice was, it sounds like this man is obsessed by what people wear, and he is to an extent, but he once said in an editorial meeting, reporters who wear ties get stories, to which I replied, even the women? And he said, especially the women, which I thought was a good piece of advice. So snappy dressing has helped, but equally one of the most salient lessons he gave me was take the work seriously, but not yourself. And I think that stands you in quite good stead, particularly when you're reporting on the royals, which is a job that quite a lot of people think is completely ridiculous. I think Armstrong and Miller used to do a really good sketch about a royal reporter standing outside a palace somewhere, literally talking complete nonsense. And I think there are some people out there who think that we make it all up. I always argue that I'd have had much better headlines and front pages if I actually made it all up. But over the years, we've covered all manner of things, from the Duke of York, remember him, being held at gunpoint at Buckingham Palace because some bodyguards mistook him for an intruder. We had probably the best scoop I ever got was the story of Harry and Meghan going out. So someone who will remain nameless tipped me off that Harry had landed this amazing girlfriend in the form of Meghan Markle. And often you'd look up Harry's girlfriends and you'd expect them to be the kind of girls that frequent the back pages of Tatler with double-barreled names. And of course, I put Meghan Markle into Google, having never heard of her nor watched her TV show Suits, which she starred in a legal drama for 7 years. And I couldn't believe the images that I saw of this extremely glamorous American actress who at one point had been the box girl on Deal or No Deal, having captured Harry's heart. And it's easy to forget, actually, that at that time when they first met, which was in 2016, Harry was a bit sort of on the shelf, and he was looking on at the Cambridges with a degree of envy because he hadn't settled down, and he was giving a number of interviews about how he came with baggage and he couldn't get a girlfriend, even though he was in many ways one of the most eligible bachelors in the UK, if not the world. And so therefore it was interesting to report on that story, and the main thrust of it was really how on earth has Prince Harry managed to land this amazingly glamorous woman. And the rest, of course, is history, and we didn't know then that of course it would lead to the Megxit and this almost constitutional crisis that engulfed the monarchy before the coronavirus pandemic hit, which in many respects I think rescued both sides from a much stickier situation than it would have been. Because if it hadn't been for the pandemic, I think you would have had Harry and Meghan very much relaunching themselves in direct competition with the royals in the USA, and I think it would have been much more problematic. Instead, what we've seen is the royals almost raised their game in response to that, and that has been epitomised, I think, by the Queen's "We'll meet again" speech, where we've really seen royals put duty and service first. And at the beginning of the pandemic, the Queen released a statement saying, "My family and I stand ready to help." And I think they've honoured that pledge, haven't they, over the last year? And I think some of the criticism that's been made of Harry and Meghan is that while the royals have been doing the day job and shining a spotlight on other people and having a national conversation about what's been going on, there's this sense that over in their £11 million Santa Barbara mansion, Harry and Meghan are kind of largely speaking to each other and themselves. And we hope that that situation will improve and that they will flex their muscles a bit more when it comes to doing their different kind of duty. But we'll talk about that, I think, a bit later with Alexander. But how I was going to conclude was to say that in the course of my career, and obviously covering, major events, be it 9/11 or royal weddings or terror attacks or Brexit or different prime ministerial successes and failures, what I always find is the most interesting aspect of the work I do is to find out the human relationships behind some of these major stories. And if you think about what is most interesting about a newspaper and what you read in the newspaper, yes, it is policy and governmental direction and the big issues of the era, but it's also very much about personalities and relationships. And particularly when it comes to the royal family, you know, yes, there is all of the pomp and ceremony, but what people always really want to know is, what are these people like? How do they operate? Who do they get on with? Who do they not get on with? And what are they like as people? And I think people find the royal family so fascinating because people are put on a pedestal, but at the end of the day, as we have seen from any royal story, from Camilla Gate to Squidgy Gate to Toe Gate to Megxit, is that at the end of the day, these people are human. And it's exactly the same fascination when it comes to Boris Johnson and his handling of coronavirus and him catching the virus and his relationship with his fiancée and his relationship with people like Michael Gove and the psychodrama at the heart of the Tory party. You know, it's always about relationships and extracting information about how people are getting on that usually elicits the key facts. And of course, that's the hardest thing to ever do. It's why series like The Crown have to make a lot of it up, because you literally, the hardest thing to ever know, and many editors have often asked it, is, you know, what does the Queen think about this? And often editors would like to say that the Queen is furious about something, and I've had to tell many editors over the years, the Queen doesn't do fury. We cannot put that the Queen is furious in a headline, because she would in turn be furious. And we know that many people have tried to ascribe opinions to her. To mention Michael Gove, the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, he's someone who, I think, according to Nick Clegg, tried to reveal what the Queen thought about Brexit, and the establishment came down on him like a ton of bricks. So the kind of information I'm extracting is not always the most forthcoming, but when you do find out these nuggets, I think it can not only make for a good journalistic scoop, but sort of remind ourselves of our own innate human nature, and the way that we react to others is often because we identify or empathize or sympathize with them. It isn't always about bad news, it's also about making connections between these people and the general public. So on that note, Alexandra, I think I'll end there, and you can delve into some questions that you think this online audience might be interested in.
Well, thanks, Camilla, very much. I thought that was absolutely fascinating, and I'm sure we all completely agree with you when you say that we're very interested in the relationships between the personalities. Before we get on to the royal family, let me just ask you about a couple of personalities. One of them is Boris himself. He's had a huge year. He has his girlfriend has had a baby. He's become a father again. He has instituted his divorce proceedings. So all of that must have been a very big personal upheaval. He's contracted COVID. He ended up in hospital. He has had to deal with the COVID issue, which he, of course, would never have thought about at the time of the last election, which wasn't all that long ago, just over a year ago. He's had to navigate Brexit, which he appears to have done very successfully in negotiating the new agreement with the EU. What do you think? How do you think he is traveling himself? We can read about his policies and his direction in the newspaper and his roadmap, which you describe as he's taken the scenic route towards.
The Beatles song, The Long and Winding Road.
Yes.
117 days until lockdown ends. My God. But it's interesting, that question, Alexander, because actually let's think back to 2016 when Boris Johnson stepped down as Foreign Secretary, and politically he was in the wilderness. And he's a funny politician because lots of politicians come with little tribes and entourages, and he's always been a bit of a lone ranger, Boris, which has made it quite complicated when it comes to kind of shoring him up and propelling him to power. And actually, in the end, I looked back on it recently, his speech, his resignation speech, and how punchy and full of verve and the typical sort of bojo mojo made that speech. And if you look at it on YouTube, obviously the benches are filled with MPs, and it's a completely different atmosphere inside Parliament as to what we've been used to in the last 12 months. So even that's strange. And he was actually propelled to power by a caucus of Tory supporters who effectively made the decision, and I think quite rightly when you consider that he won London twice, that he was the only person under the circumstances that could really lead Britain, not only in a post-Brexit era, but also in that strange era, which is easily forgotten now, but of course formed a huge plank of the last 5 years of Jeremy Corbyn being in power in the Labour Party. He popped up, I think, at PMQs the other, was it today? I don't know, he popped up somewhere. I thought, oh God, remember him, Jeremy Corbyn. Good God. But the thing about Boris, and I had a conversation with Tom Bauer, Boris's biographer, this week for a piece I wrote about this idea that actually he's quite enjoying his newfound reputation for caution, because everyone thinks he's reckless and careless and cavalier, and actually he's confounding expectations with this very steady as she goes approach. It's also completely discombobulated Sir Keir Starmer, the Labour leader, because you know, when you're in opposition, you want to attack everything the government's doing. And of course, Starmer has no choice but to agree with the government prudence, because it's the kind of slow coach approach he's been advocating from the start. At the beginning of the pandemic, we had, I think, a kind of blustering and boosterish Prime Minister, not having really quite got to grips. And I think we can forgive him for this, because I don't think most of the country had got to grips with exactly what we would be facing back in March 2020. I mean, I remember saying to the girls at school, you know, don't worry, we won't be homeschooling for long. This will all be over by Easter. And now we all look pretty foolish. Even Prince William, if you all remember, was on an engagement where he was speaking, I think, to emergency responders, saying, do you think this whole coronavirus thing is a bit hyped up? And talking about Commonwealth Day, let's not forget that the last engagement the Cambridges and the Sussexes performed together at Westminster Abbey on March the 8th last year, Meghan was hugging people in the congregation in the way that only an American actress can. So moving on to where we are now, you know, it has been an extremely steep learning curve. Many people have compared the somewhat hit and miss nature of Johnson's administration in the last 12 months with his first disastrous year as London mayor, where I think he had to fire 12 different aides for different reasons, and his entire setup collapsed. But many people said to me about that era is that it took him some time to basically get to grips with how City Hall worked. And I think it's exactly the same in government. He's a very good delegator. Some of his critics say, oh, this is because he can't be bothered to do the heavy lifting. No one's suggesting for 1 minute that he's a details man. At the end of the day, he's a journalist, and journalism is about sort of getting the facts, writing the story and moving on. It's not about writing lengthy scientific papers. So he isn't a details man, but he is somebody who is able to entrust jobs to others and to let them run with it, and actually quite favorably let them take credit for it. So what we saw is this huge devolution of power towards figures like Dominic Cummings, which I suppose would have been fine were it not for the fact that we were facing a national emergency. I don't think anyone's got any qualms about the fact that Dominic Cummings and some of those other vote leavers are hugely effective campaigners. And I know you, Alexander, know the likes of Linton Crosby and Isaac Levido and others that helped to shore up the entire Johnson administration during all of his elections. But when you then move into governmental mode, where you are trying to respond to the biggest emergency in peacetime, and you've got a situation where the cabinet has been installed to effectively be nodding dogs and supine and not challenging of governmental decisions, and then you've got a very small cabal of people taking back control, to use an analogy, it probably isn't really suited to emergency leadership, and it certainly isn't suited to fledgling leadership. But as Tom Bauer said to me this week, you know, what you have to understand about Boris Johnson is he sees himself as an historic figure. He sees himself as having staying power and being remembered. And that's not necessarily because he's got delusions of grandeur. You know, we know he's a massive Churchillian, and he's written a book about Winston Churchill and all the rest of it. It's not quite about that. But this idea, I think the Times and Rachel Silvestre had been writing some stuff last autumn saying, you know, he doesn't enjoy the job and he's on his way out and, you know, he's going to quit. And they cited the example of Stanley Johnson having never held down a job for more than 5 minutes and all the rest of it. But I think that's a huge miscalculation. I think that you miscalculate at your peril if you write Boris Johnson off too soon. And we saw Remainers saying he'll never get a Brexit deal. And indeed him managing expectations by saying, oh, well, very possibly we might no deal. I mean, anyone with any serious knowledge of the man knew that he did not want to be held responsible for a failure of statescraft. He then got the right people into the role, not least Lord Frost, to be extremely punchy with Brussels, which is something that Theresa May and her team hadn't been, and they managed to score that result. Equally, you know, as much as he has been risk averse in recent weeks, actually he is a gambler, and he put all of his eggs in the vaccine basket, and that was a big risk, and yet that risk has paid off. And by gambling on vaccines, he's now found a way out of this crisis for the country, but also for his own premiership, because actually he won't be able to rewrite history when it comes to the somewhat shambolic handling of the initial stages of this crisis. But if we accelerate because of our hugely successful vaccine rollout out of this pandemic ahead of other European nations, then of course it's going to be reflecting well on the Prime Minister. So he's an interesting character, but I would say that people have made the mistake in the past of underestimating him. And in my experience, that's not a wise thing to do.
We'll move on to the royals in a second, but just in the interest of balance, maybe you could just say a little bit about Keir Starmer and Ed Davey. Keir Starmer seemed to me to get off to a pretty good start, in spite of the problems that any opposition is going to have in a crisis like the COVID crisis. But there's been a lot of criticism of him from both the media and within the Labour Party in the last few weeks, and his ratings have started to fall. So is this just a temporary blip, or do you think he is genuinely starting to struggle? And Ed Davey, I would only say of Ed Davey that since he became the leader of the Lib Dems, you don't hear of him very much. I suppose you could criticise me and say that I'm in Australia, so you're not going to hear of the Lib Dems in Australia, though we've heard a lot about Nick Clegg in recent times in Australia because of the Facebook controversy with the Australian government. But tell us how you think they're travelling. Is there, Boris has now built up a lead with the public. I think the vaccine rollout in particular will go down, I mean, obviously really well with the public, hard for the other two. But what is the road back? What is their road back?
Well, first of all, I think you also have to take into account that it was a comprehensive election victory for Boris Johnson, and that overtaking of the red wall, or as the Tories now like to call it, the blue wall, does have significant implications for Labour moving forward. And at the end of the day, I suppose the calculation that one makes is that Labour was successfully elected under Tony Blair precisely because he wasn't too left-wing, and therefore Starmer's got a very difficult path to tread in both trying to appeal to the masses, that so-called silent majority that did end up supporting Brexit and indeed voting Boris Johnson as Prime Minister, but equally I think keeping that left fan base on side as well. I think he's made huge strides when it comes to rehabilitating the image of the Labour Party, not least with all of his statements about anti-Semitism and this idea that Labour can once again realign itself with businesses, which I think was some businesses in Britain felt alienated by some of Corbyn's far left socialist rhetoric. And equally, I think there is a sense that the nation will see him as a sensible, safe pair of hands who can clearly conduct himself well in PMQs, speak clearly. He's an accomplished orator. Obviously, there is a sense in which he has had a past and a career as a lawyer and therefore knows how to handle himself. I think the trouble is one of a policy vacuum, in that I think people are going to find it hard to identify what it is that Keir Starmer actually stands for, which is partly a product of this need to be all things to all men when it comes to Labour Party supporters. How do you appeal to the Blair and Brownites while also appealing to those who supported Corbyn in that administration? Second of all, I think being in opposition naturally means that you have less airtime, and he's having to attack a government that he actually agrees with on the pandemic response. You know, a lot of the times you've seen him in PMQs, he's had to concede that he is happy with how the government has handled the pandemic, A, because he actually is, and B, because it wouldn't be politically expedient for him to be looking like he is trying to political point score out of a national emergency. I think there is recognition within the party that they're going to have to nail down more policies. And we saw his speech last week where he tried to kind of evoke the Clement Attlee era in talking about government bonds. But again, he's always going to be accused of sort of suggesting things from the sideline and not really being heard. And it's more acute than it normally would be, because of course we're seeing the Prime Minister every week in a press conference, and the ministers that people really want to listen to are on the Tory side because they're the one enacting COVID policies rather than their opposition counterparts. So that's tricky. For Ed Davey, it's even trickier. Because they lost so many seats at the last general election, they are a much smaller voice in Parliament. And we can hear him being drowned out, I think, by the SNP constantly. There is a moment in PMQs where the Speaker has to go to Davey. He gets one question. And the next thing we know, we've got Ian Blackford talking for quite a long period of time. And with union issues at the top of the government's agenda and on the public's conscience, of course, there's a lot more talk about Nicola Sturgeon and her MPs, who are the dominant force, certainly when it compares to the Liberal Democrats in the House of Parliament. Equally, I think a lot of Ed Davey's causes, as worthy as they are when talking about things like climate change, which is a subject that the Prime Minister has heartily embraced, A, in recognition of the fact that it's high on the public's conscience, but B, because Carrie Symonds, his fiancée, is very much into green issues. That's sort of stolen his thunder. And equally, some of the other causes that Davey champions seem rather minimal and of marginal importance when it comes to a time of national crisis. So that's why we've seen, I think, him squeezed out.
Let's move on to the royal family, and I think we should start with asking you about the Duke of Edinburgh, because he's been in hospital for a week or so now, and there have been visits to him by Prince Charles and Prince William, and Prince William gave a wink and said he was okay, so that's good to hear. But what have you heard about his health?
Well, I am reassured by Buckingham Palace talking about him having gone into hospital under the abundance of caution, and the sense that he walked in unaided and that it wasn't an emergency admission. They have obviously updated the guidance and said that he's suffering from an infection which he's been treated for. To be fair, when he was admitted last week, we were told that he might not be out before the weekend. People got quite alarmed at the idea that he's in really for a whole week now, and we don't know what day is going to come out. And that does constitute his longest spell in hospital outside of a scheduled operation. And I think when somebody is 99, you're never complacent about any kind of medical treatment. But I think you wouldn't have had a situation with both Prince William in the week and also Prince Edward, who gave an interview to Sky saying that his condition had improved, if that wasn't the case. It's always tricky because Buckingham Palace won't go into details about health. And obviously we're given a bit of guidance off the record. But I think, he is stable, he's in good spirits, but he is 99 is the way I would caveat it. And obviously we hope that he'll be back in Windsor Castle soon. He and the Queen have been self-isolating there really more or less for the last 12 months. They did have a spell up at Balmoral, but not for that long. It was cut short. And I think we can all agree that it's been a really difficult time for those two. Although they are 94 and 99 respectively, they've always been very active people. Obviously, Prince Philip only retired in 2017 when he was already in his mid-90s, which has been a life not only serving Queen and country, but also working well beyond retirement age. They are independently minded. They do like to still get out and about. They've always been active of mind and body. Touch wood, they've always been remarkably healthy and not had too many health problems. So I think actually being in lockdown wouldn't have served either of them particularly well. They would have found it really frustrating and limiting. I think the Queen particularly would have really, frankly, disliked not being able to go out on physical engagements and meet and greet people. That's been the stock in trade of her entire reign. She particularly likes meeting the military, and it was significant, I think, last summer that they held a scaled down Trooping the Colour at the quadrangle in Windsor. They didn't have to do that, but I think it was because the Queen really missed it, that she missed the pomp and pageantry. She once commented as well that she finds it weird on walkabouts to see a sea of mobile phones. So while we can appreciate the fact that at 94 she's adapted to Zoom conference calls and all the rest of it, that's not her preferred medium. She wants to see people in the flesh. So I think it's been tricky. And I think if you then throw in all of the drama caused by Megxit, then it hasn't been another Annus Horribilis by any stretch of the imagination. But I think it's been a pretty tricky 12 months for the royal family as a whole. And I think as Queen, as head of state, sort of having to see the country in the grip of a national crisis, you could tell very keenly that she felt so strongly and emotionally about it when she made that intervention and gave that "We'll meet again" speech, which I would argue, along with her addressing the nation after the death of Princess Diana, is probably one of the most significant speeches she's ever given. But what's been interesting is to see her role elevated as mother of the nation. You know, we look in Britain at two figures that have captured hearts and imaginations during this pandemic, and it's been quite heartening, hasn't it, that both of them have been nonagenarians. You've had Captain Sir Tom Moore and you've had the Queen. And I was saying this to somebody the other day. We have had a situation in society where people of an older vintage have been sort of overlooked and taken for granted, and in society sometimes ignored. And yet the people who have set the example have been in that age category and have really helped to kind of raise morale and give people a boost, because we respect them because they've been there and they lived through the Second World War. In Tom Moore's case, Prince Philip's, you know, fought with distinction in it. And therefore, I think it's interesting that the nation has taken heart from those sorts of really experienced figures.
You mentioned earlier that you had been around to ROSL to do an interview with ZDF, and I did an interview with them myself there as well, in the what's called the Brabourne room, I think it was. And it was about the Queen. And I made the point that I have never come across anybody more dutiful than the Queen. And duty is the word that you'd use to associate her, that you'd use to describe her more than any other single word, I think. So she does put duty before everything else. And with the Sussexes, with Harry and Meghan, she has been pretty tough, hasn't she? She said, well, that's it. If you want to go and live over there in California, you'll be struck off the team. You'll now have to lose. They want to turn it into a permanent arrangement, not a one-year temporary arrangement. You're going to have to lose all your patronages of one kind or another, including the military ones. It must be very hard, because Harry is her grandson, and presumably she's very fond of him. But she does put these issues of duty and propriety and the Constitution ahead of her personal emotions that she may have about people in her family.
Yeah, and I think the epitome of public service is personal sacrifice, isn't it? It's about saying that this is the way we have to do things. And actually, no one is bigger than the institution of monarchy, not even the Queen. I mean, her catchphrase, if you like, is that we're around for as long as the public want us here. And equally, that we need to be seen to be believed, and we need to be seen to be doing a job and shining the spotlight on the causes that we're championing. We are the conduit, really, to public understanding and an awareness of military, voluntary, and charitable causes. And I think on a personal level, no one necessarily can begrudge Harry and Meghan for having made the decision for their immediate family that they didn't want to be trapped in the confines of the institution of monarchy and to do the job as it is traditionally done. What I think rankles is this idea that they felt that they were bigger than that institution and could somehow change it with this, as they announced it in their Megxit bombshell, progressive new role within the royal family. At the end of the day, it is extremely difficult to be a full-time working royal while simultaneously seeking financial independence elsewhere. It's also virtually impossible to be doing the job if you're living in Santa Barbara. The last statement the Queen issued was really carefully written in basically making the point that although they are no longer working members of the firm, they are members of the family. And if there is a silver lining to the dark cloud that's hung over this issue for the last 12 months, it's that now these loose ends have been tied up, and this discussion about whether it is possible to be half in, half out, cake and eat it royals, now that that's all been tied up and they have been, in a business sense, completely divorced from the royal family, all that's left now is to settle and improve familial relations. And I think actually it was a barrier, because there were constantly discussions going on about, well, if they want to go and do Oprah, how does that sit with Prince Harry being Captain General of the Royal Marines? How do we handle the cenotaph? And yes, you're right, Alexandra, in saying that the Queen has led from the top on this and has insisted that the way it is done is that you are either a fully fledged working royal or you are not. There isn't some kind of in between. And that door being left open for 12 months, that was about giving them a safety net. That was about saying to them, look, we understand why you want to do this. We understand why you want to move to America. We understand about the intrusion that you faced and the fact that you want to prioritize your immediate family over the so-called family firm. But what we're saying to you is we're going to leave the door ajar if you go off to America and it isn't quite what you thought it was, and you have second thoughts and you decide you want to come back. That was what that was all about. What subsequently happened, of course, is that the couple have done hugely well in landing very lucrative 6, 7, 8-figure deals with the likes of Netflix and Spotify, which means that that has emboldened their vision for what they want to be in America, but further separated them from the firm, because their success in their gaining of financial independence is what actually drives the wedge even further between them and their royal role. The more that you act like an independent celebrity, making money for yourself on the back of your own initiatives, the less you can be associated with the public work and the public face of the monarchy in the UK. And that's what this has been about. I find it weird that people have been shy, not least the Sussexes themselves, about what this was about. For them, this was about seeking independence, finding freedom, being with their immediate family, trying to avoid scrutiny and press coverage. Well, I never quite bought that, because you don't go to
No,
the private in LA,
they
right?
seem very keen on press coverage.
Well, exactly. And I'm sure people might want to ask about that. But this was about money. I mean, people are very shy about that in this country, but this was about them feeling that they had an enormous platform, feeling restricted in what they could do, particularly the Duchess. And there's no shame in this, sensing that their global fame would be more lucrative to them in America. And that's the decision they've made. You know, it's 2021, so I don't begrudge them that. I just wish they'd been a bit honest about it and said, you know, and made it clear that this was about, and we're not saying for 1 minute that the royals don't earn good money or they aren't, you know, loaded, but they live very different lives to the sort of, you know, MTV Cribs Hollywood lifestyle of kind of splurging cash on hot tubs and designer clothes. You know, you've met royals, Alexander. They they live, they don't live frugally, but it's not razzmatazz and jazz hands. And if that's what Meghan wanted, and she comes to this institution and she looks around and thinks, God almighty, you know, the pipework's showing and the carpets are threadbare, I could be living like a Kardashian. It's no wonder she hot-footed it back to LA. Harry clearly loves her. He clearly loves his son, and they've now got a baby on the way. And that's the decision he's taken. I just, you know, at the end of the day, there was a financial imperative that I think the couple have kind of tried to conveniently cover up in the interests of seeming virtuous about it all. You know, it's America. Of course, it's the land of dreams. That's why they're in LA.
In about 10 days, they're going to be revealed on the Oprah Winfrey show. They've already done the interview, I read.
Yes.
What is that about? I mean, why would they be doing that? And it goes back to something you said earlier, that they said they wanted to get out of the public eye, but actually they clearly don't. They clearly want to be in the public eye. Now, they're not going to use this interview to pour boiling oil on Buckingham Palace, I assume.
Well,
they're going to talk about their causes.
You'd hope not least with the Duke of Edinburgh's health situation. And I think, to be fair, the Sussexes people have said it would be just ridiculous to suggest that they're going to start making acrimonious remarks about their royal relatives. And certainly, I think Harry would not want to disrespect the Queen, who at the end of the day is his beloved granny and his grandfather is his beloved grandpa. This is about the US audience. This is about Meghan particularly not really caring about what people think about her in the UK anymore, and concentrating on her own profile in the US. And there's talk about her obviously later down the line going into politics, who knows. And Oprah is obviously the right platform for both sides, most successful of African-American outside of Barack Obama in sort of recent history. The undisputed chat-show queen of the US, and therefore a sympathetic audience and ear. Of course, there are people behind Palace Gate scratching their heads going, well, makes it happen more than a year ago. Why are you still banging on about this? Because we certainly aren't. We haven't said anything about it, apart from the odd source quotes to the Sunday Times or whoever about William being shocked and saddened, or the Queen being, quotes, disappointed. Why are you still banging on about this? But of course, you know, we are denying reality if we say that the only reason why Meghan is really truly globally famous is because of her association with the royals. And therefore, what else do you talk about? I mean, people didn't know her name particularly well outside of the small group of fans who watched the Suits show, or might have known her from her TIG blogging website or whatever. So this is about really properly establishing themselves in the US. Of course, I find it hypocritical to have a couple on one hand talking about their privacy and being invaded, and then on the other happily invading it themselves with revelations about intimate details of their private lives, either in print or on Oprah. But this is also about media control, and it's very much an American approach to exert control over the media and the narrative. I cite the example with celebrities, you know, of massive kind of ball-breaking agents who are in charge of people like Tom Cruise and Nicole Kidman and Angelina Jolie, you know, insisting on copy approval and saying, well, if you aren't nice about Tom Cruise in this magazine, you're never going to get Nicole Kidman for that, and all this kind of game playing. That's a very American approach. It just doesn't wash in Britain. The press doesn't take that kind of flannel. And equally, the royal family's mantra has always been never complain, never explain, rise above. Don't be like celebrities engaging in tit for tat, sort of he said, she said. But the couple don't seem to want to adopt that. They want to have a go every time the media writes anything. But it's a slippery slope because, of course, while I don't think for 1 minute the media should write anything that is incorrect, using unnecessary invective, is defamatory, or anything like that, at the end of the day, all of your coverage isn't going to be positive, because people, going back to my original point, are human. And the idea that the public will just swallow a one-sided view of what has gone on, I think, is ludicrous. And of course,
well, I think that being seen to be going out over the last year, endeavoring to make huge amounts of money, that's their ambition, and they've been successful with, you mentioned the Spotify and Netflix deals they've done. I mean, eye-watering amounts of money that they're apparently being paid to do podcasts and films and so on. You might have noticed there's a COVID crisis on. People are dying, there are lockdowns, people are suffering, while these people are over in Santa Barbara making huge amounts of money. I'm not sure how well that resonates, trying to be neutral here, but I'm not sure how well that's resonating with the public. And I saw you wrote an article the other day in the Telegraph about their opinion polling in the UK. As you say, Meghan probably doesn't care about it, but they're struggling with the British public. Not so much here in Australia, they're not that unpopular here, but in the UK, they really are struggling with the public.
But also, I think because of the pandemic, to be fair to them, there's been a lack of substance in what they're doing. There's been a lot of chat. I mean, some people, myself included, I think I did describe some of it as word salad. I mean, what does any of it mean? But I think there is an impetus to do more. And I'm looking forward to doing that, because I do think they're a formidable couple. And when Meghan first came on the scene, I was one of those sort of like praising the Lord that there was somebody different who had something else to offer, a mature woman who knew her own mind and all the rest of it. But you know, that point they made about service being universal, and that prickled people at the palace, because while it's hugely commendable to do stuff for charity and be a philanthropist, and we hope that they will put their platform to good use, doing stuff for charity, being a philanthropist, is not the same as being a public servant. That they're two different things. And then people were saying, oh, how dare you lecture Harry on service? He's served in the military. Absolutely. This is what surprises me. Prince Harry, of all people, knows what public service is. He's served 2 tours of Afghanistan, grew up with a mother and father who absolutely understood the meaning of public service and then some. And yet he seems to think it was a good idea to have issued that statement last week, lecturing the Queen on what service and duty is.
Yeah.
Bill Gates wouldn't describe himself as a public servant. He would describe himself as a philanthropist, and that's brilliant. But let's not confuse these two issues.
Yeah, well, and there's the issue of being a royal on the one hand and being a celebrity on the other. In a sense, the royals are not meant to be celebrities. They're famous, but they're not meant to be the celebrities in the sense that the Kardashians are celebrities, or Nicole Kidman, or whoever you wish to choose. We've got just from the audience some questions. If I could just run, you can see them popping up. So there's David Bennett asked a very interesting question. What is the establishment, in inverted commas, in 2021? Where does it begin and end? That's a very interesting question.
That's a great question, David. I mean, I suppose we talk about the establishment being our key institutions, the monarchy, the government, even the BBC. Don't we? I think maybe I'm using that term a little bit too loosely. I suppose we think that it's people in high profile positions where we expect a degree of accountability for their actions. Maybe that's what the definition of the establishment is.
People move in and out of it quite quickly too. Some do. Colin Petter has asked, how likely is it that Prince Harry will remain in the line of succession and retain the title of Duke of Sussex and Meghan Duchess, given their withdrawal from a life of public service?
Good question, Colin. I think on the issue of the titles, I don't think there's any chance that they will be taken away from them, because that dukedom was given to Harry upon marriage. It's almost like a marriage present from the Queen, and it would look very acrimonious on her behalf to take that from them. They have been instructed under the terms of the so-called Megxit divorce deal that they not use those titles when they operate in America in a commercial sense. The line of succession thing, again, I think that's unlikely. I mean, at the end of the day, he's been bumped down the line significantly by the Cambridges having 3 children. And although he hasn't got titles for his child Archie, and indeed won't have one for the second child, I think there is a sense of wanting to remain in the pecking order. At the end of the day, he is the son of a future king, and therefore I think it would be very unlikely for him to step away from that, even though he is stepping away from his royal duty.
It would be hard to. I wonder if legally it would be possible. I suppose he could renounce his position in the line of succession if he wanted to.
He could do, but people also need to remember there are comparisons often made between the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, you know, Edward VIII and the abdication and all the rest of it. But that was, you know, these two aren't living in exile. They're still part of the family. They've just decided to stop performing official engagements and to live in another country. That is a different thing. And I think as well, when you think about that last statement from the Queen, talking about them as beloved members of the family, you wouldn't see any interventions like that.
No. Nick Friend asks, what is your view of the future of the union? How do you feel the royal family's what do you feel the royal family's attitude might be?
Well, I think the issue of the union is obviously top of the in tray at Downing Street. And it's interesting that there's been a bit of a shift around in staffing so that David Foster's gone on to work on Brexit and taken that responsibility away from Michael Gove at the Cabinet Office, so he can concentrate on union matters along with another dedicated team. That's how significant it is. From Boris Johnson's perspective, of course, he will deny the SNP referendum, but if they hold an advisory one and it is, as we suspect, strongly in favour of yes, then of course it poses problems. And there is a significant shift, I think, that we can determine in the post-Brexit world of people that obviously were promised by Cameron that if they stayed in, they would also stay in the EU, and they haven't. Having said that, I think the economic picture for Scotland alone in the EU, if that could even happen, is really bleak. And I don't know whether it means they'd have to be in the Eurozone and Schengen and all the rest of it. And obviously, because of their dependence on oil and their own situation economically, it could be very, very dicey. And one would expect in the coming months and years for the government to keep on hammering home that argument. The complete capitulation of Labour in Scotland is hugely problematic for the Tories because, of course, it strengthens Nicola Sturgeon's side. Yes, we have seen some tittle-tattle in the form of this Alex Salmond sex stuff. But again, there is smoke. There is no smoke without fire, but I think people are being over-ambitious if they think that's what's going to fell Nicola Sturgeon, but I could be wrong. So yeah, union is a massive issue. The royals, of course, would be absolutely devastated if the Scotland separated. We remember the Queen's subtle intervention, wasn't it, outside church, where she said she hoped the Scots would do the right thing. And I think we all know what that meant. And let's not forget
No,
as well,
think very carefully. Think very carefully about what they were going to do. That's what she said.
Think very carefully, she said, within earshot of a BBC camera. And to be fair, figures like the royals do a hell of a lot to try and keep the union together. If you think about Princess Anne, for instance, being patron of Scottish rugby, or William of Welsh rugby, the Prince of Wales making a hell of a lot of trips westward. Historically, we've had a lot of visits to Ireland and Northern Ireland recently by the Queen, and most notably recently by the Cambridges, and indeed the Sussexes got out to Northern Ireland. So they've done quite a lot as ambassadors for the UK and Great Britain, as opposed to just England. So I think they would be mightily unimpressed if suddenly there was some sort of separation of powers.
The last question I'll ask you, Camilla, is about sticking with the royals, going back to the Duke and Duchess of Sussex. What is the truth of the relationship between them and the Cambridges? Is this strain in that relationship, the disagreements, is that exaggerated by the media, or has there been a real falling out between them?
Well, it's not exaggerated. I mean, I was the person who originally reported on the rift at the bridesmaid dress fitting between Kate and Meghan. But to be fair, I wrote that down because it was a case of a postnatal Kate and a very stressed out Meghan, I think, some issue about tights coming to a head, which is the kind of girly nonsense that I think everyone encounters when they're in the lead up to their wedding. So perhaps don't read too much into that. There was certainly something about those two women not having very much naturally in common. Kate's an introvert, Meghan's an extrovert. There was a sense perhaps as well of the Duchess not throwing her weight around as much as dominating a number of engagements which the Fab Four attended. And I suppose you can see it from the Duchess of Cambridge's point of view. She'd been on the royal scene then for more than a decade, and suddenly someone new is coming in. Not that she felt envious or threatened, but I think there is a way of doing things in royal circles. There's a hierarchy when it comes to the royals themselves, and equally their staff. Some of the acrimony that built up was because Harry and Meghan threw their weight around a bit when it came to dealing with the Queen's staff. And when you're at the top of the Queen's tree of royal household employees, you probably don't take kindly to the sixth in line to the throne and his wife, who you don't know very well, making demands about tiaras and whatnot in the run up to the big day. I think it's safe to say, and it's really sad, that the reports of the tensions between the brothers are accurate, and that Harry did resent William for seemingly not being entirely supportive of what William perceived to be a rushed courtship with Meghan. I think he was just looking out for his little brother and thinking, I hope he's not rushing into anything. We don't know much about this woman. And Harry, being someone who is quite impulsive and wears his heart on his sleeve, felt that that was not supportive of the woman that he loves. And I think we can understand all those sorts of dynamics. I think it's been unfortunate as well that if it wasn't for the pandemic, Harry would have come back to the UK a lot more in the last 12 months, and that relationship could have been repaired quicker. We know that at the Sandringham summit, that was the first time that they were properly back on reasonable speaking terms. And that wasn't an acrimonious meeting, not least because the Queen was in attendance, but actually they were having perfectly reasonable conversations. There's been contact on the phone and via video links since, but I am told that the relationship is not what it once was, and we don't know whether it will be. And that's really sad. But, you know, sometimes the dynamics of any family changes upon marriage, and priorities change. And I think we can all identify with the idea of being really close to siblings when you're growing up and you're trying to find your way in the world, and then your priorities switching to the woman that you love and the children that you have, and different priorities. But yeah, it's sad because we saw them and have always regarded them as brothers in arms, and we hope that maybe through the medium of this new baby, because I'm sure both sides are keen for the cousins to be in touch, albeit transatlantically, maybe the new Sussex baby might be the tie that binds.
We'll wait and see. We don't know whether it's a, do we? No, we don't know whether it's a boy or a girl yet, do we?
No, apparently they know, we don't. Will we ever find out is the question, Alexander. Now they're
We
in
will
control
eventually.
of media. We will eventually. We will extract that information eventually. There'll probably be a photograph with Oprah at some point. we may even say an ultrasound picture in the Oprah interview. We live in hope.
Yeah, we live in hope. Camilla, an hour is up, and you've been wonderful with your time, and it's very much appreciated, not just by me, but by and the ROSL team, but by all the members who have tuned into this. It's been absolutely fascinating. We've traversed the Prime Minister and his character and how he's getting on with COVID and Brexit, to Keir Starmer and Ed Davey, and then right through the Royals. We'll look forward to reading your report of the Oprah Winfrey interview. We look forward to seeing the interview as well. But maybe we look forward more to seeing the Queen on Commonwealth Day and seeing what she has to say, because as usual, she'll be very dutiful. But thank you very much for being dutiful to us and spending your time with us. It's very much appreciated. And we look forward to seeing you round at ROSL before too long.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm sorry it wasn't in person, and I do hope to be there in person at some point in the future. So thank you.
Great. Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye now.